The night shift began at 9 p.m., and the first thing Mick, the man in the gray security uniform, received when he stepped into the main building of Centricor Dallas branch was silence. Not a single nod, not a greeting, just a quick glance from the receptionist packing up her things and the hollow sound of the automated coffee machine echoing in the cold marble lobby. There was no name tag on his chest. No one knew who he was, and it seemed like no one cared. Mick walked straight to the security desk on the ground floor, switching shifts with the previous guard. A big white guy who looked more used to giving orders than taking them. He handed Mick a worn-out clipboard without bothering to look at him, muttering flatly, "Lights on the 14th floor tend to stay on even when no one's there. Don't waste your time checking it. System glitch." Then he stood up, adjusted his belt, pulled a soda bottle from the fridge, and added with a hint of sarcasm, "Oh, and if you get cold, tough luck. I'm not responsible if old guys doze off and forget the heater." Then he walked off, leaving Mick alone with a clipboard, a slowly rotating camera, and the indifference of a system that had no room for curiosity. Mick didn't react. He simply sat down, adjusted his cap, and began scanning the surveillance monitors. Something about the way people looked at him, or didn't surprise him. Maybe it was because over the years he had learned, when you walk into a room with no title, no suit, no authority, you start to see who really looks at you as a person and who only sees the title on your chest. And tonight he wore no title at all. Top left screen, parking lot, empty. Top right, hallway on the 8th floor, lights flickering. But the one that caught his eye was the 15th floor. A technical office, no night shift assigned, yet the desk lamp in the far left corner was still on. A slender figure had just stood up, grabbed their coat, and disappeared through the door. Mick checked his watch. 9:12 p.m. According to policy, all tech staff must leave the building by 9. He took note, not to snitch, but to understand. Why did people here consistently break protocol, and why did no one seem to care? He stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and began his first patrol. The long hallway leading to the elevator was eerily quiet. Glass walls reflected his shadow. A black man, over 50, tall and lean, but with eyes still sharp in a way that only someone paying close attention might notice. When he reached the 15th floor, the office was dark, except for the left corner. A small desk lamp still glowed. Mick opened the door quietly and stepped in. The room was empty, but there was a still warm coffee cup and an unlocked laptop showing the building's internal camera dashboard. He didn't touch anything. Instead, he bent down to pick up something on the floor. An access card. No photo, no name. Just a faint line of text. "Guest, do not interfere." He froze. That wasn't standard system-printed text, and it had no ID code. For a CEO specialized in security and data like him, this wasn't just a guest pass. This was a custom-made card, not registered in the main system, and whoever owned it clearly didn't want to be tracked. On his way back to the lobby, he happened upon 3 IT employees leaving their office late. One of them, a tired-looking young man clutching a laptop, paused and looked at him. "You new here?" Mick nodded. "Yes." The young man looked at him for a moment, as if wanting to say something. Then he turned away, but not before whispering, "Don't try to do things right around here, sir. People who do things right are usually the first ones out." He stepped into the elevator, leaving Mick standing in the empty hallway, fingers tightening around the nameless card in his pocket. By the time he returned to the desk, the clock had struck 10 p.m. Someone had left a note on the table, scribbled in red ink. "No need to patrol floor 12. Already checked. The D could stand for Darren, the daytime security manager. But that wasn't part of the standard protocol. According to Centricor's internal guidelines, no one, not even management, is allowed to exclude a floor from nightly patrols without an officially logged reason." Once again, something felt off. Mick unfastened the cuff on his left sleeve, gently pulling back the skin near his wrist to reveal a small scar. A mark from his early days in freezing cold server rooms at the old Ohio headquarters. The place where he once stayed up nights modeling internal ID trace systems, the very system now powering this entire network. Irony, it was he who built the system, and now he had to use it to investigate his own company from the role of someone invisible. Outside the building, cold winds started to sweep through the side corridors. Trees rustled. Over the Dallas sky, a crescent moon drifted behind thin clouds. Under the neon lights, Mick's faded gray uniform reflected dimly. No one would suspect this was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech corporation. But in the dark, some people don't need light to see clearly. They just need enough silence to listen. And tonight, Mick Carter, the man with no name tag, had begun to hear the first sounds. Not from the cameras, but from what the system had missed. An unidentified access card, a light left on past curfew, an employee pushed aside, a handwritten note that broke protocol, and above all, a sleek, modern building far too cold for anyone to dare speak up. Mick's second night shift began exactly like the first. An empty front desk, a sluggish coffee machine hissing as if it too were tired of serving nameless shadows, and a building that emitted a very particular kind of silence. Not one of peace, but of something that had been suppressed for far too long. Mick arrived 15 minutes early. He sat at the security desk, adjusting the surveillance camera angles, this time paying special attention to the upper floors, areas where there shouldn't be any movement past 9 p.m. He knew well, irregularities don't usually make noise. They emerge from things that should remain stable, but don't. At 9:04, camera feed 11, the hallway on the 12th floor flickered slightly, a brief flash, then a fade, then the image cut out. 1 minute later, it returned as if nothing had happened. Mick didn't react. He wrote down the timestamp, the camera code, and the glitch. Everything still fell within the bounds of explainable technical hiccups, if you wanted to believe that. But he didn't. Not after what he'd seen with the Do Not Interfere access card the night before, and especially not when the malfunctioning camera happened to be on the same floor as the data office, the room that held the internal surveillance archives from the past 4 weeks. Mick decided not to patrol the hallway immediately. Instead, he checked the keycard entry logs. The terminal at the security desk didn't grant full access, but it could still display the total number of entries within designated timeframes. A chart appeared. The day shift showed 234 scans. The evening shift from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. showed 41. But from 9:01 until the current time, 9:48 p.m., the system displayed no activity detected. That couldn't be right, because he had just seen someone glide through the 15th floor hallway at 9:26. Either the logging system was being tampered with, or someone was coming and going without scanning a badge. Mick looked again at the nameless access card in his pocket. Do not interfere. A directive, a warning, or a quiet message reserved for those with special privileges? He had only ever seen cards like this used in 2 scenarios. 1, for high-level internal investigators. 2, for people who didn't want to be seen, legitimately or not. Just then, the door behind him opened. A man in a rolled-up shirt, early 40s, entered, carrying the scent of strong cologne and a hint of irritation. You the new guard? Mick nodded. Name's Mick. The man didn't shake his hand, just replied, Darren. I manage site supervision here. If you've got anything to report, leave it on my desk in the morning. Then he glanced at the camera monitor behind him. That camera 11 always flickers. Don't worry about it. Don't write up a report. No one reads them. With that, he gave the desk a light pat as if bestowing a favor, then walked off. Mick sat still for a while, not because he was offended, but because the man had just confirmed what he needed. The camera wasn't broken. It had been deliberately shut off, and someone knew about it. He opened the internal building map on a secondary system, the kind that doesn't log activity, and marked 3 cameras that had shown similar behavior in the past 48 hours. All 3 were located at intersections between hallways and storage rooms, and notably, they all blinked off between 8:57 and 9:32 p.m. every Friday. He stood up, grabbed his flashlight, and headed to the 12th floor. The hallway lights were on but carried a faint, musty smell. One door was slightly ajar, an auxiliary equipment room. Mick shined his light inside. There was a folding chair, an empty soda can, and a private Wi-Fi modem, unlabeled by company inventory. A rogue device, discreetly installed to transfer data externally. Subtle traces, but to Mick, it felt like staring at the early days when he built the original security system. The same kind of tools, the same kind of silence. But now it was being used for something else. He was about to unplug the device when footsteps echoed behind him. Mick turned, pretending to examine the hallway light fixture. A figure walked past. It was Darren. He looked at Mick with mild annoyance. "This floor has already been checked. I left a note. No need to dig around." Mick nodded, gently closed the equipment room door, revealing no emotion. He understood it was too early tonight to make a move, but it was far too late to pretend he hadn't seen anything. When he returned to the security desk, a file folder had been placed there. The label on the cover read, "Shift Reports, Archived Weeks." Someone wanted him to see it, or wanted to bait him. Inside were night shift logs from the past 3 weeks, complete with signatures, but with one strange detail. Each night listed 3 on-duty personnel, even though policy only allowed 2. And one name, RB, appeared on every shift, but had no matching employee record attached. He opened the printout of access badge records. No card matched RB. Only one card had no name at all, the Do Not Interfere card. Another night, another mask beginning to crack. And beneath that mask, Mick knew. This wasn't just about procedural violations. It was about a system complicit, silent, and fully aware of what it was hiding. On the camera control panel, there was one frame that rarely changed. The corner of the technical room on the 11th floor, just one desk, a server tower in the corner, and a young employee who sat there nearly every night. No one paid attention to him. No one came by to talk. No one ever left a word of thanks, even though the data system kept running smoothly, day after day. His name was Jalen. Mick had noticed Jalen since the very first night, not because he did anything wrong, but because he was too quiet, a kind of quiet that felt unsettling. In the world of security systems, quiet zones are either the safest places or the most forgotten. And in the workplace, people are no different. On the third night, Mick decided to visit the 11th floor around 9:15. The server room door was slightly ajar as usual. Inside, Jalen was typing something on the screen, eyes locked on lines of code. He didn't look up when Mick entered, but he spoke, very softly. "The camera on the 12th floor last night. You saw it flicker, right?" The question made Mick pause for a second, not because of the content, but the tone. Jalen wasn't asking like someone guessing. He asked like someone who knew. Mick nodded. Jalen continued. "It was log suppressed. They erased the trace at kernel level." He stopped, then looked over at Mick for the first time. "Are you really just a security guard? Or something else?" Mick didn't answer. He simply stepped inside and placed the shift report file he had found the night before onto the desk. Jalen glanced down, flipped through a few pages, paused at the name RB, then let out a tired, cynical laugh. "RB doesn't exist, but if you ask Darren, he'll say it's a special operations coordinator. If you ask HR, they'll say no such person exists. And if you ask IT, they'll stay silent. Because everyone knows someone's there, but no one dares say the name." Mick sat in the chair across from him, silent. He let Jalen continue. The young man pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "I managed to download a copy of the camera logs before it was deleted, but I never sent it to anyone. If I did, they'd find a way to pin it on me. Or worse, I'd disappear like Allie." Allie. The name caught Mick's attention immediately. "The morning shift programmer?" he asked, keeping up his role as a curious gatekeeper. Jalen nodded, his expression dimming. "She once reported Greg Morgan for assigning female staff to night shifts inappropriately. The result? She was transferred to the auxiliary data room, lost access to the main repository, and eventually vanished from the system like she never existed. Greg hadn't fired her directly, but in the way this system worked, all Greg had to do was withhold protection, and the system would quietly discard inconvenient elements on its own. That's what made it most dangerous. Not evil people, but a structure designed to treat good people like operational errors." Mick opened the USB. Inside was a video clip from Friday night. The 12th floor hallway camera flashed for one single frame before it was wiped. A man in a white hoodie, masked, entering the server zone. No access card, no alarm. The movement was fluid, almost pre-programmed. The man walked in and disappeared behind the door to the secondary server room, the very place where Mick had found the rogue Wi-Fi modem. Jalen spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. I trust you. But if you're planning to go further, don't do it alone. You'll vanish like Allie, like RB, if there ever really was an RB. He stood up, grabbed his coat. Before stepping out, he turned to Mick, and this time, there was no doubt in his eyes. I don't know who you are, but if you're here to listen, then listen fast, because this system, it's erasing everything, night by night. Mick stayed seated for a while, the overhead lights flickering faintly. He didn't need to know more to understand. This young man was standing on the edge. Not the edge of a technical fault, but of trust. And the more advanced a system is, the more easily it can erase trust. Softly, silently, terrifyingly. As he exited the 11th floor, the elevator was empty, quiet, but someone had slipped a piece of paper into the crevice between the wall panels, a trick used by those who want to communicate without leaving a digital trace. The paper held just 4 words, 12:47, Friday, listen. No name, no context, but it was enough for Mick to know something was going to happen, and something, or someone, wanted him there to witness it. Mick wasn't entirely sure what made him decide to find Allie that night. Maybe it was the look in Jalen's eyes when he mentioned her, or maybe it was the tightness in Mick's throat when he realized the nameless card was still tucked inside his chest pocket. Whatever the reason, it was strong enough to make him press the button for the 9th floor, the old technical wing that was rumored to be shut down, though no one had ever truly cleared it out. If someone had been quietly pushed to the margins, this was the place they ended up. The door opened with a dry creak. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed wearily, just like the dust-covered ceiling. No one was there, but a woman's jacket hung over the back of a chair, and a half-finished coffee cup sat on the desk. Mick stepped in slowly, scanning the room like a man looking for traces of someone who'd been erased. Not by software, but by deliberate neglect. On the desk, an open folder waited. The bold title read, Internal Audit, Gender Allocation of Night Shifts, Confidential. Mick flipped a page. The data column was clear. In the past 6 months, 84% of solo night shifts had been assigned to female staff. A handwritten note in red ink below read, female staff less reactive, easier to coordinate. A blade that didn't need to draw blood. Just as he was reading, the back door opened. A woman in her 30s walked in, hair slightly tousled, eyes steady but carrying exhaustion that ran deep. She paused for a second when she saw Mick, but didn't seem afraid. She tilted her head slightly. You're Mick, right? Jalen said I should leave the door open. Mick nodded. I didn't mean to intrude. She sat down, arms crossed, and asked, so what do you want to know? About Darren? Or about how I got dumped down here? Mick didn't answer right away. He simply said, I want to understand why someone like you would be considered a threat to this company. That made Allie laugh. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh people use to push back a pain they can't quite explain. She spoke slowly, like every sentence was a thorn being pulled from her throat. I didn't accept that a female employee had to work 5 night shifts in a row just because none of the guys wanted to. I wrote a report. I sent it to HR. I sent it to Greg. You know what the response was? She pulled a yellow scanned note from a drawer. On it, a handwritten comment with a scribbled signature read, she's too soft for security. Reassign. Too soft for security. That was how they labeled people who wouldn't bow their heads. And reassign meant being removed from the radar. Access revoked. Voice silenced. Turned into a shadow sitting on a forgotten floor no one cared about anymore. Allie looked directly at Mick, and for the first time her gaze dropped its guard. I used to think staying silent would help me keep my place, but then I realized if keeping the job meant losing yourself, then there's nothing left worth keeping. She stood up, reached into her pocket, and pulled out a portable hard drive. I've got copies of the shift allocation requests, recordings of internal meetings that were taped without consent, and a list of people who've used the guest do not interfere access card. One person used it 9 times in the past month, and their initials are RB. Mick wasn't surprised, but he didn't feel relieved either, because what Allie held wasn't just evidence. It was proof that people who knew the truth didn't disappear because they were wrong. They disappeared because they were right, and that made them targets. Before he left, Mick looked back at her. "Why are you still here?" Allie answered without hesitation. "Because I know someone's going to ask one day, where did Allie go? And if I'm not here when they do, then there'll be no one left to answer." Some people are kind enough to remain inside broken systems just to make sure certain questions don't vanish forever. As Mick exited the 9th floor, he realized the coldness in this building didn't come from the air conditioning. It came from how good people were treated like nuisances, and those who should have been held accountable were instead handed the power to silence. On his way back to the security desk, Mick passed Darren in the hallway. Darren had his arm around a new hire, laughing loudly, then stopped to give Mick a smirking glance. "What's the night guard doing down on the 9th floor? That place is just for the filtered out, you know." Mick just smiled, saying nothing. But inside, he knew one thing for certain. The man who just laughed was running out of time, because Mick had been listening, and listening, when done at the right moment, becomes the act that changes the system from its very core. The internal card scanning security history at Centricor was praised as one of the strongest corporate security frameworks in the southern United States. Every entry and exit left a log. Every card was tied to an ID, and every ID was linked to a name, a title, an access timestamp, and a verified device. That was the theory. But theory never accounted for the fact that some cards don't make a sound. Mick returned to the security desk with the hard drive Allie had given him, just as the clock struck 2:04 a.m. He plugged it into a secondary terminal, a network line accessible only by security personnel to log unofficial observations, not part of the main report system. The screen lit up, data loaded, and like a ghost finger pointing at a system long believed to be unbreakable, the report showed clearly 9 times in the past 30 days, an unregistered card had accessed Level 3 operations control, a zone restricted to senior security personnel only, and every incident had occurred after 9:15 p.m. on Fridays. Mick pulled up hallway camera footage for those exact time frames. Once again, the images flickered. Just briefly, a figure in a white hoodie walking calmly. No badge, no hand on a door, no keypad. The door opened automatically as he approached, as if the system was programmed to recognize his presence. But there was no facial recognition. No ID trace. Nothing. A shadow inside the system. Or worse, a part of it. He checked the system's secondary log for anomalous badge authorizations. One card ID appeared, the only one unmatched by any personnel in the HR database. The accompanying note contained just 2 lines: override access, manual approval, GM. And with those 3 letters, Mick knew he had landed on the name everyone decent in that building quietly tried to avoid: Greg Morgan. No more doubt. Greg wasn't just the head of the office. He was the one who granted access to a non-existent entity. And that meant he knew he might be the mastermind, or the one being used. But one thing was certain: he wasn't innocent. As Mick recorded all the data into a separate logbook, he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn, just gave a small nod, as if already used to unannounced presences. "I thought you didn't work Thursday nights." The voice was familiar, surprised but not hesitant. "Shift change. Needed to check something." It was Lena, the operations deputy, the same woman Mick had awarded a scholarship to nearly 20 years ago when she was a struggling college student in Atlanta, living on food assistance and biking 2 hours a day to reach the public library. Lena stepped closer, glancing at the screen without commenting. She said almost in a whisper, I know you're not a security guard." Mick still didn't turn. "And I know you're not blind to the rot in this place." Lena bit her lip, eyes filled with quiet conflict. "You don't understand. I tried speaking up once, but after I lost access to my project accounts, I got it. Around here, if you don't stand still, you get erased first. Mick looked at her, finally turning. I understand, but you've forgotten one thing. Silence is a form of complicity, and some people stay silent so long that when they want to speak again, they no longer have a voice. Lena didn't argue. She just stared at the screen, where the log still glowed with the words manual approval. A blade she herself had once confirmed with a single click. Not out of malice, but out of obedience, and the fatigue of someone who had once been a victim, then slowly became a tool. Mick closed the folder. I didn't come here for revenge, I came to repair. Lena asked softly, and once it's fixed, who stays to protect it? Mick answered slowly, the ones who once got it wrong, but are brave enough to remain. That wasn't a judgment, it was an invitation to return to the right side, for those who had once lost their way. After Lena left, Mick printed a copy of the nameless badge log and placed it in an envelope. On it, he wrote one line. If a badge doesn't beep, is the flaw in the system or in the people who designed it to stay quiet? He slid the envelope into the executive-level secure drop box, where Greg Morgan would check it in the early morning. At 3:27 a.m., Mick stood and went on patrol. The 12th floor was silent. As he passed the technical room, the light spilling through the cracked door reflected in Jalen's eyes, still fixed on a stream of code. The young man didn't speak. He simply raised a hand, a silent gesture between those who both knew. Something larger was stirring beneath the surface of the system. Mick stepped back into the elevator, caught his reflection in the mirrored glass. Same gray security cap. Same nameless uniform. But in his pocket now, he carried two things: evidence and a reason. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start rewriting the first chapter of an organization that had long gotten used to no one daring to knock on the leadership's door after 9 p.m. Friday returned as if it had never left, and with it, something shifted inside Centricor. Though on the surface everything looked the same. Cold hallways, polished nameplates on office doors, and hollow greetings between employees who brushed past one another like ghosts in tailored suits. But to Mick, the change wasn't in anything measurable. It was in the looks, the glances that now avoided his eyes, the nods that were more forced than usual, the doors that closed just a little faster when they heard his footsteps. The system had sensed something infiltrating it, and it was beginning to recoil like a wounded animal. 9:06 p.m. Mick had just logged his shift when he was urgently summoned to the ground floor surveillance office. The caller was none other than Darren, the morning shift supervisor Mick had been intentionally avoiding direct conflict with. Darren was already seated, drumming his fingers on the desk like he set the rhythm for the whole building. We've received a security complaint, he began without a greeting. There was unauthorized access to the secondary camera system. Time, 2:03 a.m., Thursday night. He paused, locking eyes with Mick. You want to admit to anything? Mick didn't blink. I use the secondary system to check the logs of a malfunctioning camera. That's within the scope of the night shift. Darren smirked. Not if you didn't file a prior report, and not if you accessed data restricted to senior security clearance. He slid a printed page across the table, a screen capture of the secondary system interface. Mick's terminal IP was clearly displayed beneath bold red text. Unauthorized access, flagged by internal protocol. Mick didn't say a word. He knew this wasn't an investigation, it was a trap, and he had just stepped into it, exactly as they'd planned. Darren leaned in, his tone now triumphant. Greg Morgan wants to speak with you. Right now, 4th floor. He pointed to the elevator behind Mick. Good luck. The 4th floor housed the executive operations wing. No security personnel were allowed there unless summoned. The door opened, and Greg Morgan was already waiting, arms crossed, flanked by 2 stone-faced women in business attire. Greg gestured for Mick to sit. We'll keep this internal. If you agree to sign this acknowledgement of a minor violation, you'll be suspended for 3 days. After that, you can return. Or not. Mick picked up the paper. The wording was short, smooth, as if drafted well before any incident had occurred. The word violation appeared 3 times. Oversight showed up twice. Agree to accept responsibility was printed both at the top and bottom. There were no phrases like suspected system flaw or investigative review. Just one clear message. The system didn't want questions. It wanted someone to nod and close the file. Greg placed a pen on the table, staring at Mick. I know who you are, Mick. Or maybe I don't know your name, but I know your type. New guy. Curious. Thinks he's here to save the day. But in the end, you all have to choose, nod or disappear. He smiled and tapped the table once. So what'll it be, security man? Want to be a hero or keep your job? Mick didn't touch the pen. He looked up calmly. I once lost everything because I refused to sign something like this. But I've also seen what happens to those who do sign. They don't lose their jobs. They lose themselves. Greg sneered. So you'd rather lose both? Mick stood, leaving the paper unsigned. I'd rather make the system look at itself. And you know, it doesn't like that. As he walked out of the room, no one stopped him. But he knew he'd just been placed on a list. Not the official kind. The kind reserved for those who were difficult to manage. The ones who asked questions. The ones who knew there was rot hiding behind the chrome-coated automatic doors of this building. The ones who didn't stay silent when the system started choosing its next victim. Back on the ground floor, Jalen was waiting near the break room entrance, his face tight with concern. I've been called to Greg's office tomorrow morning. They said I accessed the system using a flagged ID, which they say belongs to you. Mick clenched his jaw. The trap wasn't just set for him. It was for anyone who got too close to the truth. They stood in silence for a few seconds, as if saying one more word might cause everything to collapse. Finally, Mick placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder. Not firm, not weak, just steady enough to hold a bit of calm in a young man about to be charged with an unnamed offense by a system that feared being named. You did nothing wrong, he said. They just need someone to hide the thing they won't speak out loud. And this time, it's you. Jalen looked at him, not with fear, but with understanding. The understanding of someone who knew, not everyone who speaks wins, but everyone who stays silent always loses. And like Allie, like Lena, he had stood close enough to the edge to know the choice was no longer between right or wrong. It was between allowing the truth to be buried, again, or not. My boss's name is Miles Carter. If he knew about this, Jalen said just before walking away. He left the executive office carrying 2 sheets of paper, a formal warning, electronically signed by HR, and a notice requiring him to attend retraining on internal culture. The word retraining was in all caps, like a cleansing ritual more than a learning opportunity. He hadn't been fired, but clearly, he'd been marked. When he quietly returned to the server room, everything looked unchanged. Servers humming, lights glowing, data pulsing behind walls of tangled cable. But once you're summoned to the office on a Friday morning, you're no longer just staff. You're under watch. And he knew it. Every second, every breath, since stepping out of the room where Greg Morgan wielded his pen like a bladeless executioner. Mick found Jalen slumped at his desk, head in hands. Not from pain, but because he was fighting, between holding on to his belief or letting go of it to keep his place. Mick sat beside him, saying nothing. He simply placed a bottle of water on the table and stared straight at the server screen, as if it might speak the things 2 black men didn't need to say out loud. Silence isn't a choice, it's a trap. Jalen sighed, speaking without lifting his head. They think I'm too young to resist, too new to speak up. But they forget I lost my father to a company just like this, where people knew it was wrong, but no one spoke. And I'm not letting myself become the next link in that silence. Mick asked quietly, did you ever tell anyone else about the nameless card? Jalen nodded. One person. A while ago, he worked in operations. Used to be a student of my old mentor. He told me if this ever got too big, there was one person who could flip the whole system, and he whispered that name to me. Just once. He paused, gauging Mick's reaction. Miles Carter. Mick didn't move. His heart only skipped 1 beat, just enough to know the moment had landed. But his face remained still, calm, inquisitive, as if hearing the name for the first time. Jalen continued. I thought he was just a name on a document, The founder who never showed up. A ghost. They say he lives overseas or sold everything. But the guy I talked to said he still watches. And if he ever came back, this system would be exposed. Mick stared into his own reflection in the dark monitor. He didn't ask anything, didn't confirm, didn't deny, just silence. But within that silence, something began to turn, like a rusted gear finally shifting again, even if just one small click. Jalen exhaled. I know I just signed my name onto the blacklist, but I don't regret it, because for the first time, I saw the system afraid, and I don't think it's afraid of me. It's afraid of the man I just named. He turned to Mick. If you meet him, if you know him, tell him someone hasn't given up. Mick nodded slowly. I'll tell him. And in that promise, there was nothing extra, because he wasn't saying it to reassure. He was saying it to confirm that Miles Carter, the man everyone assumed had vanished, was sitting right there in front of Jalen, in a gray security uniform. No name tag, no title, unrecognized by anyone, but listening to every word. That night, Mick returned to the security desk, opened the internal messaging system, and sent a brief message to Lena. The game is on, and it won't stop now. No signature. She would understand. At 9:47 p.m. on the camera feed, a hooded figure reappeared, this time on the 10th floor. He passed through a blind spot, then vanished down the hallway behind the auxiliary data vault. But this time, Mick had reconfigured the backup recording system. And this time, no one could erase the log. The system had grown used to blinding itself. But for the first time, it was the one being watched. Lena had been sitting in the 4th floor strategy room for nearly an hour, unable to get through even half a page of the document on the table. She was used to emergency meetings, to risk assessments, to familiar phrases like team restructuring or access rights review. But tonight her eyes were fixed on one handwritten note. No title, no sender, just 6 words. The game is on. It won't stop. She knew who sent it. No signature needed, and that alone made her throat go dry. Some truths don't require confirmation because their mere existence is enough to make you tremble. At 23, Lena had been a scholarship student under the Miles Carter Foundation, a fund created by an anonymous entrepreneur to help minority students pursue careers in cybersecurity. Back then, she lived in a rundown apartment in the slums of Atlanta, juggling 3 jobs, and regularly sent thank you emails to an address that never replied. She never saw the founder's face, but thanks to him, she didn't drop out. And thanks to him, she got her start at Centricor as an intern, then a technician, then a team lead, and eventually deputy director of operations. And now she was sitting between 2 worlds. One was the system that had brought her up, and the other was the man that system had chosen to forget. When Mick walked into the room, she didn't look up. She didn't need to. His voice was calm as always. I came to ask the one thing you've never answered honestly. Why did you approve access for an unregistered card? Lena didn't flinch. She just sighed, slow, heavy. I didn't create it. I just didn't refuse it. And around here, refusing means losing your place, your role. Mick stepped closer, standing across from the table. Did you ever think about the people who lost more than just their place? Ally, Jalen, the ones forced into silence or made to disappear? Lena looked up. I think about them every night, and it's because I think about them that I stayed, to keep the door from being shut forever. Mick said nothing. He knew that wasn't an excuse. It was the kind of logic many decent people cling to in order to survive within broken systems. But the problem is, keeping the door from closing doesn't mean you're not the one locking it from the inside. He placed a file on the table. It was a printed copy of the Do Not Interfere access approvals, granted using Lena's ID. 2 of them had occurred right after shifts with log conflicts, meaning during that window the system had been compromised. Not by accident, by assistance. Lena stared at the file without speaking. Her hands tightened slightly. Do you think I wanted this? Greg called me in one night, said the system needed to smooth out post-audit processes. Told me if I signed off, I'd be safe from the upcoming personnel review cycle. What choice did I have? Mick looked at her, his gaze not accusing, but not forgiving either. At the start, maybe you didn't have a choice, but after that, each approval was a choice. Lena sat silently for a long time. Then she said something Mick hadn't expected. I know who you are. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement. I recognized you the first night. Only you would know how to edit camera logs without getting flagged. Only you would know who to ask and when. She paused, then asked gently, what are you going to do to me? Mick exhaled slowly. Nothing. I didn't come to punish. I came to repair. And I need someone who knows the system from the inside, not to tear it down, but to rebuild it from within. Lena closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them, and for the first time since he entered the room, she spoke in a voice no longer guarded. If you're really still here for people like me, then I'll open the door. As Mick left the room, he knew, some doors don't need a key. They only need the person guarding them, to have just a little bit left to believe in. Monday, 8:52 a.m. Conference room, 31st floor, Centricor headquarters, Dallas. Inside, an emergency meeting was underway, titled Crisis Response Data Breach Review. Greg Morgan, the regional operations director, confident to the point of arrogance, was droning on about security vulnerabilities, supervisory negligence, and suspicious activity from junior staff. His tone sounded more like an informal indictment of someone who wasn't present. Jalen. Greg manipulated the board with doctored figures, polished reports, and the cold confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. The room fell silent as Greg finished. A few board members flipped through pages. Lena, the deputy director of operations, sat quietly at the table's edge, avoiding eye contact, as if she didn't want to be part of the performance, but couldn't exit the stage. Allie wasn't invited. Jalen, of course, wasn't present. He had been suspended. Greg nodded to his assistant, who shut the conference room door. No recording devices allowed. I want everyone in this room to be clear. The system is leaking from the inside. If we don't act decisively, our firewall won't be worth a dime. Just then, the door that had just been closed opened. A man in a gray security uniform stepped in, holding a folder, his expression calm. Every eye turned toward him. A few people murmured irritably, assuming this was a security error. Greg frowned. Who let the night guard in here? Greg slammed a hand on the table, sneering. This isn't the break room. The man didn't respond immediately. He gently placed the folder on the table, looked around the room, quiet, steady, unbowed. Then from his chest pocket, he pulled a badge. Not a standard employee card, but a silver CEO ID engraved with the name Miles Carter. My name is Miles Carter. I'm not in the wrong room. But are you? His voice wasn't loud, but it struck like thunder in the room, desperately clinging to professionalism. No one spoke. A board member dropped their pen. Lena froze. Greg went pale. No one had imagined the legendary CEO of Centricor, the man who had withdrawn from media and declined every interview for over 2 years, was sitting right here, disguised as a night guard. And certainly no one imagined he had been watching the entire system from the basement, the place where people had ignored him, barked orders at him, insulted him. Miles sat down, uninvited. He opened the folder. I'm here to present an internal investigation conducted over the past 8 weeks during the night shift. Personally gathered, analyzed, and verified by me. Greg struggled to stay composed. What is this? This is against protocol. Miles looked up. Protocol? Which one? The one that shuts cameras off every Friday night? The one that authorizes guests do not interfere badges with no access logs? Or the one that suspends an employee for telling the truth? He emphasized every word. Around the room, heads began to lift. The tension coiled like a wire ready to snap. Someone in this room once told me, guys like you belong in the trash lot. That was the nicest thing I heard as Mick, the night shift guard. No one laughed. No one knew where to look. Greg pushed back from the table. This is theater. You went undercover? You spied on your own company? Miles didn't blink. I investigated. I didn't need a disguise to see who's really running this organization. And how? He activated the presentation screen. Images flashed across it. Footage of Jalen being summoned to management after tracing the anonymous badge. Logs showing automatic data deletion via anonymous proxy. An email from Greg to Lena with the line, "Approve quietly. No flags." Lena lowered her head. Greg shot up, growling, "You don't have the right to present this without legal board review." Miles stood, walking slowly around the room. "I did review it, with myself. I don't need permission to restore the truth." He stopped in front of Lena. "I won't ask why you approved those authorizations. I'll only ask, do you still want to be someone people trust?" Lena trembled slightly. She looked into Miles's eyes, not those of a CEO, but of the man who had once given her a scholarship, believed in her, and now was disappointed. Greg pointed at him, addressing the board. "I demand his immediate suspension. We need time to verify." The oldest board member from New York interrupted. "Greg, I think you should sit down. I want to hear the rest." Greg went silent, and for the first time, no one was listening to him. Miles gathered the folder, nodding to the board. "I will forward all this data to Legal and the Ethics Committee. I'm also requesting a governance restructuring session to be held this week." A phone buzzed. Greg glanced down. An internal message from Legal. "Stop pushing back. We have video evidence. Do not resist." Miles exited the room. He didn't say another word. When the door shut behind him, the room sat in stunned silence. A man in a guard uniform had just walked in, and the system, once believed to be impenetrable, had begun to crack from within by the very man who built it. Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. No cameras, no press, just the 12th floor at Centricor headquarters. Once used to filter out those deemed unfit for corporate culture, the room had been renamed the briefing hall. But today, no one was being evaluated. They were being heard. Miles Carter, CEO, once dismissed as the old guy napping in the lobby, entered wearing a simple charcoal suit. On his wrist, still the cheap plastic watch he'd worn on the night shift. He hadn't taken it off, not out of forgetfulness, but to remember. There were no title plaques on the table, just handwritten name cards: Jalen, Ally, Lena, Ava, the employee whose discrimination claim had been buried. Devin, denied promotion for not bar hopping with the team. Maricel, the janitor who helped Mick when he dropped his dinner one night. They weren't summoned by mandate. Each had received a handwritten note. "I heard you when no one else did. Do you still have something to say?" No signature, but everyone knew who sent it. Miles opened the meeting not with a speech, but a question. "We've seen the system from the bottom. If you could rebuild it from scratch, what would be the first thing you'd change?" Jalen sat up straight. "Remove manual deletion of access history. It allows people to become ghosts." Allie glanced around. "Limit night shifts for women, not for safety, but for fairness. No one should have to prove they're strong to be respected." Devin added, "Stop measuring culture fit by who drinks with the boss." Ava smirked. "And stop asking every Asian candidate if they're good at math." Laughter broke out, not because it was funny, but because finally they could laugh, without being recorded, misquoted, or told they were too sensitive. Miles took notes in silence. For the first 15 minutes, he said nothing. Then when the room began to settle, he slid a thick binder into the center of the table. "This is the new system proposal. I call it System Reset, but not to forget, to remember, and never repeat." The 74-page document was built on 3 pillars. 1. Transparent security protocol. All access logs, audio, and badge activity encrypted bidirectionally. No one, not even the CEO, can delete access history. All anonymous entries audited every 7 days by AI and confirmed by a human. 2. Listening board. A council formed from all levels: security guards, coders, admin, and management. They may convene quarterly to propose internal policy changes. They do not report to the CEO. They report to the entire company. 3rd, no name audit. Every quarter, 10 random guest badges or non-tracked accesses are reviewed and reported. Anyone who authorizes a do not interfere badge must submit a public justification. If no valid file exists, disciplinary action follows. The room was silent, not with fear, but with expectation. Miles pulled a small wooden box from his briefcase. Inside, his old guard badge. No chip, no name, just two faded lines he once wrote in marker. "If no one knows your name, will they still respect your voice?" He held it up. "I used to think the company would only listen to me if I wore the CEO badge. I was wrong, because when I had no name, I finally heard the voices no one else had. And I saw those we should have seen all along." Lena bowed her head. Her hand trembled on the table. Miles turned to her and asked gently, "You once told me, back then, I was just following orders. Today, if leadership is wrong, who do you choose?" Lena looked up. "I choose the system that listens, even if it reminds me how long I stayed silent." Miles nodded. "Then I choose you to lead the Ethical Firewall Task Force, to rebuild the system from within, not because you never failed, but because you have the courage to repair." Jalen turned to Lena. A nod, enough to mean forgiveness. No hugs, no tears, just presence, together. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. No one left. No one checked their phone. At the end, Miles placed a sheet of paper on the table. Not a legal form, not an NDA, but a listening commitment with just 3 lines. No one is invisible in a place they've helped build. No one is silenced because their title is smaller. And no one should have to wear a disguise to be respected. Each person signed. No pressure, no refusals. That afternoon, the entire CentriCore system received an email. Subject, reset activated. From Miles Carter, CEO. "We do not restart to forget the past. We reset so that no one has to wear a uniform to be heard again. Welcome to a system built not to silence, but to listen." Attached was a photo, the "Do Not Interfere" badge, slashed through, pinned to the glass wall of the ground floor. Beside it, a handwritten note. "Don't interfere. Maybe it's time we do." Jalen. The image spread across the company, not for PR, not to share a CEO quote, but because people saw themselves in it. And the place once known as high security, cold heart, for the first time, began to feel warm. Not because the system got better, but because the people were finally seen, heard, and called by name. The ground floor of CentriCore had once been nothing more than a cold space, a place where security guards sat behind fog glass, where hurried footsteps passed without a glance, where no one ever asked, "How's your shift going?" and where no one cared if the cameras turned off early. But now that very space was being transformed, and for the first time in the company history, people didn't call it security control. They called it the listening room. Miles Carter didn't hang a CEO title on the door. There was no special scan code. Anyone could enter, so long as they had something to say, or something they'd never been allowed to say. There was no conference table inside, just soft fabric chairs arranged in a circle, an old guitar leaning against the wall, a few small potted plants, and a wooden plaque engraved with, "If your voice was once ignored, this space was built for you." On the glass wall behind it hung a row of old employee badges, no longer active, no access privileges, but under each badge was a note. He warned about the system bug. She refused to falsify data and lost her job. The first to ask why logs were being wiped weekly. People who were once discarded like corrupted files were now being restored as part of the company's memory. 1 week after system reset was announced, Miles chose a quiet Thursday afternoon to sit in the listening room. No announcement, no meeting, just presence. Jalen was the first to walk in, no longer closed off, no longer wearing his headphones to avoid being noticed. He brought a design sketch for a new security scan interface with a new feature, anonymous reporting for data discrepancies. He placed the draft on the wooden table, then hesitantly asked, "If the old system was built to stay silent, can the new one learn to ask, 'Are you okay?'" Miles didn't answer right away. He simply nodded. If the system can't, then the people inside it must. A little while later, Allie arrived carrying a folder, not a report, but a list of 17 women who had requested night shift changes for safety reasons, requests that were ignored. She wanted to call each one, Personally, no emails, no HR. Not to apologize for the company, she said, but to let them know someone's changing, and they deserve to be seen. By late afternoon, a quiet surprise. Lena entered the listening room. She didn't come as the leader of Ethical Firewall. She brought no laptop, no authority, just a middle-aged woman who had once stayed silent, now sitting in the circle and saying, "I used to think listening meant preparing to respond. Now I've learned listening means not adding more hurt." Silence fell over the room, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was a space for truth. Miles stepped forward, placed his hand on a crossed-out badge, and quietly returned to his seat, nodding. Some systems need to be reset. Some people just need to be heard once, and they begin to heal themselves. After that day, the listening room began receiving more visitors. No one was required to speak, but they came anyway. A janitor dropped off a photo of his mother, fired from her last job for being too old. A young programmer brought a USB drive containing code that once proved someone tampered with company data, but no one had believed him. A retired security guard, who had worked nights with Mick, quietly stepped in, sat for a while, then left a handwritten note. "I used to think no one saw me. Turns out someone remembered." The listening room didn't change the system, but it changed how people walked into the system. And then something unexpected happened the following Monday morning. A new badge appeared on the wall. No name, no photo, just a single black line of text. "Gray uniform number 1, he listened first." No one said it aloud, but everyone knew it was Mick, the man once called old, slow, the one who mopped floors, stood guard, and sat longer in the dark than the system he helped build. Now he didn't need a CEO badge, didn't need the head of the table. He sat in the circle as a listener. And for the first time in years, the company began to speak. On Friday morning, something felt different in the main lobby of Centricor. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Today was the official reveal of the new Sentinel 3.0 security interface, a version that carried not just technical upgrades, but restored moral values. All eyes turned toward the stage at the center of the atrium, where the CEO was expected to appear in a light gray suit with a lapel mic, delivering a powerful speech about the future direction. But that didn't happen. At exactly 9 a.m., no one stepped onto the stage. Instead, at the far end of the hallway, a man in a gray security uniform and worn black shoes with no name badge was quietly walking forward. No one recognized him at first. Some thought he was the new janitor. Others froze. Allie placed a hand on her chest. Jalen didn't blink. Lena swallowed hard. The man stopped at the center of the atrium, not on the stage. He didn't look into the cameras. He looked at the people, one by one, as if calling roll, not by name but by gaze. Then he spoke. No mic needed. "My name is Miles Carter, but you once knew me by a different name. Mick." The entire room fell silent. "I used to work nights here. I mopped floors. I got sent out for coffee. I was told I was too old to understand tech. Someone even said I'd be better off guarding a junkyard." A single awkward laugh broke out, then vanished. "But I'm not standing here to take credit or reclaim reputation. I'm standing here to return something we once lost, a place where good people don't have to hide." He walked over to the table where the new interface had been placed. He didn't press any launch buttons, no slideshow. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a wooden name badge, old and scratched. Mick, night security shift. Miles held the badge high. "I didn't keep this to remind myself I went undercover. I kept it because some roles teach you more than your real title ever could." He placed the badge into a glass case, beside a USB drive containing all the leaked data that had once been erased, and a leather notebook filled with 41 handwritten confessions from employees who had once been silenced. After that unplanned speech, Miles stepped away from the circle, left the stage. He didn't wait for applause, but the entire room stood up. No one clapped. They just stood, quiet, as a way of honoring, not the position, but the man who came back to the very place that once dismissed him, to rebuild it from the roots. The press conference was canceled. No need. The media wrote about the event under the headline, The CEO didn't talk about technology, he talked about courage. 1 month later, Sentinel 3.0 officially launched, but no one remembered what color the new interface was. They only remembered this. From now on, every warning message included a new option: send anonymous signal to the listening room. On the wall behind the reception desk, instead of a company slogan, there was a new inscription: "We're not afraid of bad people. We just refuse to let the good go unheard." As for Miles, he didn't return to the executive suite on the 32nd floor. He took a small desk on the first floor, inside the listening room, where he covered one shift each week. No speeches, no meetings, just listening. And on his 60th birthday, he wrote a single line on a sticky note and posted it to the wall. Justice doesn't need applause. It just needs someone patient enough to stay until the truth speaks for itself. Maybe you've been like Jalen, bowing your head not because you were wrong, but because no one would listen. Or like Allie, believing kindness could protect others, only to be told that made you weak. Or even like Miles Carter, who once founded a dream, then had to return to its roots to rebuild it with his own hands. And if your heart paused when Miles said, "I don't want a company that fears the bad. I want a place where the good don't have to hide," then you're not alone. Because many people watching this video have also felt invisible in the very place they helped build. So if you've ever been silent, overlooked, or witnessed injustice but didn't know where to start, maybe this is your quiet reminder. We can change that. Share your thoughts below. Who were you in this story? Have you ever met a Greg Morgan in your life? Leave a comment, because your story might give someone else the courage to finally speak up. If this video touched you, hit like. And if you believe justice starts with small actions, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Share this with someone you believe needs to see this. Thank you for staying until the end, because maybe, just maybe, those who truly listen are the ones strong enough to change everything.